So we're here today to talk about aggregate demand, and you'll notice that a lot of things that we discuss are really similar to what we covered in Unit 2, which was the law of demand and supply. So the word aggregate here just means total, and this is a macroeconomic concept. So instead of looking at demand for one product or one industry, we're looking at demand for all products in the entire economy. And what we look at, or the definition of aggregate demand, is real GDP, that's GDP adjusted for inflation, that is desired at every price level. So instead of price and quantity, we're looking at price level, which refers to inflation, and real GDP, which is how much stuff are we producing. Just like the law of demand, there's an inverse relationship between those two variables. So when we look at an aggregate demand curve, it's going to look really familiar. The curve itself is that same downward sloping curve as we saw in the law of demand, but what you'll notice is on the y-axis, instead of price, it is labeled as price level, so it's a reference to inflation. And instead of quantity on the x-axis, we've got real domestic output, or in other words, real GDP. So just like in the law of demand, aggregate demand can shift right or left. Rightward shifts would be an increase in aggregate demand. That means we're making more stuff in the entire economy, regardless of price level. In other words, the GDP is getting bigger. And we know that when the GDP is getting bigger, that indicates an economic expansion from the business cycle. So we're just tying all of these concepts together that we looked at in Unit 2 and 3 with this final unit. Aggregate demand can also shift to the left. We can see a decrease in how much stuff we produce at every single price level, and we know when GDP decreases for 6 months or more, we call that a recession. So leftward shift of the aggregate demand curve could be referred to as a recession as well. Basically, the aggregate demand and aggregate supply model is just another way to express these concepts that we've been talking about. We can look at it on the business cycle. We can also look at it in the aggregate demand, aggregate supply model. So just like in the law of demand, there are aggregate demand shifters, things that will cause those rightward and leftward shifts. And you're going to recognize these as well, because what we're looking at are the four components of GDP. So our formula is C plus IG plus G plus XN. Each one of those four categories does impact the aggregate demand, or can impact the aggregate demand curve. So the first one is consumer spending. Consumer spending, obviously, if it increases, GDP is going to increase. If it decreases, GDP is going to decrease. But the question is why? Why would consumer spending increase or decrease? And that's what the items on the screen refer to. So one thing that can happen is consumer wealth changes, and that's the value of investments. If the stock market crashes, for example, the value of everyone's investments that's invested in the stock market decrease. When people see those balances go down, they're a little bit more cautious about how much they spend, and so you might see consumer spending decrease as well. The opposite would also be true. Stock market's going well, people feel good about the balances in their retirement accounts, they might be more likely to spend. The second part of consumer spending, or thing that can impact consumer spending, is household borrowing. Generally, if people borrow more money, that means they're spending more. The opposite is also true. Consumer expectations, which we talked about in Unit 2, if people are feeling optimistic about the economic future, they'll spend more money. If they're feeling pessimistic or not as encouraged based on what they see, they'll spend less money. And then the last one there is personal taxes, not taxes on corporations, but individual income taxes. If the government increases taxes, people have less money to spend, consumer spending goes down, aggregate demand shifts left. If the government decreases taxes, they have more money to spend, people spend more, and the GDP would shift right. The second aggregate demand shifter is investment spending. So that goes along with the IG, investment in GDP. Investment spending is when businesses purchase capital in order to expand. And there are two things that impact businesses' decision-making process in general. The first one are, what are real interest rates? How much is it going to cost me to pay back this expenditure? Second thing are expected returns. Okay, so if I do invest in this new capital, new computer system, or new fleet of vehicles, Is it going to cause me to increase my profit as a business? So if real interest rates are higher, it costs more to borrow, businesses borrow less. If real interest rates are lower, it costs less to borrow, businesses will borrow more and spend more in investment. If expected returns are high, again, going along with that expectations idea, businesses tend to invest more, and if expected returns are low, they'll invest less. Third demand shifter, aggregate demand shifter. Oops, forgot that was in there. Ignore that. Third aggregate demand shifter is government spending, and this is pretty simple. Either the government increases its expenditures as determined by Congress, or they decrease their expenditures. If government spending goes up, aggregate demand shifts right. If government spending goes down, aggregate demand shifts left. And then the last one is exports, net exports. And we can look at this two different ways. We can look at it as the balance between exports versus imports. So like how much stuff are we exporting versus how much stuff are we importing? If we export more than we import, the net export number goes up and aggregate demand shifts right. If we import more than we export, net exports goes down and aggregate demand shifts left. The other way that this can be processed, however, is by looking at exchange rates. So if the dollar is strong against other currencies, then the net export number tends to be higher. If the dollar is weak against other currencies, the net export rate tends to be lower. So I'm not going to ask you specific questions dealing with exchange rates. All you need to know is that either the balance of exports and imports can affect the net exports and affect aggregate demand, or exchange rates can affect net exports and aggregate demand. And that is it as far as it goes. So just a quick recap, aggregate demand is looking at the real GDP demanded at every price level. It's an inverse relationship. This results in a downward sloping aggregate demand curve that can shift right to indicate an increase, left to indicate a decrease. And there's four shifters, which include the four components of GDP. So consumption or consumer spending, investment, government spending, and net exports.